I want to tell you a story about my own experience as a negotiator. A few years ago, I was teaching weekend courses on negotiation at Beijing University, and during the middle of the week, I had a couple of days off. So I decided to visit the Great Wall of China. I was about 300 meters from the wall when I realized I didn't have a camera. What would have been perfect was one of those 27-shot, one-use disposable cameras, but I hadn't thought to bring one. But then, a few paces ahead of me, I noticed a woman selling that very camera on top of a card table. So I went over and I asked her how much she wanted, and she took out a calculator and tapped $30 US. Now, even I know that was too much for a camera, but what was I going to say? I hadn't been expecting this conversation, so I thought for a moment, took the calculator, and tapped $10. She acted like I was threatening to steal everything she owned and run off toward the wall with it, very upset. We go back and forth for a moment, and we finally agree to $12, which I pay. I thank her. I take the camera. And as I walk away, I actually hear me say to myself, well, I got her way down from 30. And I walk toward the wall, and soon I discover 4 other women selling the same exact camera for $5. And you get the irony? I was there to teach them how to negotiate. In this session, I want to look with you at a simple question. If you and the other negotiator don't agree, what will you do instead, and what will she do instead? At the Great Wall, I had no idea what I would do instead, and I suffered for it. Not a lot, but you get the idea. The lady with the cameras knew I didn't know about the other sellers, and that for all I knew, she was my only chance. I lacked leverage. She had it. Leverage is simply the ability to influence things in your favor through relative advantage. It's a bit like being on one end of a seesaw. The higher your end is, the lower the other's is. The higher your leverage is, the lower the other's is. While it's not the same thing as power, which is a broader term, it's an important part of the power to get what you want. If I'd been able to shop around, or even if I knew that was possible, I would have had more leverage, and things might have gone quite differently. Understanding and comparing what each side can do if there's no deal is central to gauging how much leverage you have in a negotiation, as well as key to knowing when to walk away, when to give in, and when to negotiate. So it's important to know how to learn each side's relative position and how to develop yours. Very important. If you are a hostage, almost by definition, you have no leverage at all, and so you'll have virtually no ability to negotiate. So much of what a negotiator does hinges on the challenge of developing leverage. In 1963, while in prison for his work protesting racial discrimination, Martin Luther King Jr. read an open letter in the local newspaper from a number of clergymen questioning his tactics and asking why he did not negotiate. In reply, Dr. King wrote what is now known as his Letter from Birmingham Jail, in which he said this: "You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are exactly right in your call for negotiation. Indeed, this is the purpose of direct action. The purpose of nonviolent direct action is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. Too long has our beloved Southland been bogged down in the tragic attempt to live in monologue rather than in dialogue." In other words, Dr. King was highlighting the point that nonviolence is a crucial way that previously powerless African Americans could peacefully acquire leverage. In that sense, nonviolent action championed by King, Gandhi, and others is very much about improving the success of the oppressed at the bargaining table by building leverage. In their outstanding book, Getting to Yes, Roger Fisher, William Ury, and Bruce Patton introduced an idea that can help us better understand leverage: the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, or BATNA for short. An alternative to agreement is what you might do on your own if you cannot reach agreement with the other side. The best of these choices is your BATNA. So, for example, imagine you're negotiating for a new job with Company X. If those talks don't work out, what will you do instead on your own? Imagine you have another job offer elsewhere, that you've been thinking about going back to school, and that sometimes you wonder if it might be fun to quit work and go write a great American novel. Each of these three choices is an alternative you could pursue instead of reaching an agreement with Company X, and the best one for you, by definition, would be your BATNA. Now, some will tell you that BATNA, leverage, and power are the same thing. The reason a hostage has no leverage is because he has no BATNA. He either does what the gunman tells him, or he dies. Still, I think it's an oversimplification to say BATNA, power, and leverage are the same exact thing, in part because there are ways to acquire power even if you don't have a BATNA. For example, experts on hostage negotiation advise that if you ever are a hostage, God forbid, it's wise to do whatever the gunman says, but it's also wise to let him know, to let him get to know you as a real person. That's because the more he sees you as a human being, the harder he may find it to hurt you. That illustrates the power of rapport building. It also illustrates there may be other sources of influence besides the ability to walk away. In a sense, much of our course is about the wise acquisition and use of different kinds of power. That said, I agree that BATNA is usually a good first approximation of your leverage in a negotiation. If you're desperate and the other negotiator isn't, you'll probably get the lesser of the bargain. So our focus in this session will be on the simple but critical idea of BATNA because it's so closely connected to leverage. But precisely because these and other negotiation terms are so powerful, here I want to make sure I'm being clear about my use of language. Earlier in the course, I introduced the idea of an option. Here, we're talking about something different, alternatives to agreement. At first blush, they may sound similar, but they're not. So let me take a moment and explain that important distinction. An option is a possible deal term, a tradable, something that you can offer to the other side or that the other side can offer you. It's anything that you and the other side might agree to. In contrast, an alternative to agreement is something that you will do by yourself if you cannot agree with the other side. So, for example, imagine a landlord and a tenant are negotiating at a lease renewal. They might have several options to discuss, including a 5% increase for 1 year, a 3% increase each year for 2, or an agreement to keep the rent the same and waive the annual paint job. But meanwhile, each negotiator has several alternatives to agreement. Among other things, the landlord could rent the place to another tenant instead, sell the building, or find a reason to evict the tenant. The tenant could, among other things, find another place to rent, could buy a house, or sue the landlord for wrongful eviction. You get the difference? If you and I are negotiating, our suggestions are options. What I might do without you are my alternatives to agreement. Throughout our course, I will use the terms options and alternatives to agreement as separate and distinct concepts, in part because most negotiation experts and books draw the same important distinction, and in part because understanding that difference can make you more effective. Indeed, BATNA may be one of the most effective and important ideas in the field. As I mentioned in an earlier session, a couple of years ago, I surveyed over 150 of my former students, executives who'd graduated 3 to 10 years before. They reported that they valued most of our negotiation concepts, but tied for number 1, to my surprise, was BATNA. Why? I was frankly surprised myself because, in a sense, BATNA is an extremely simple idea you've known since you were a child. My mama told me you better shop around. And if you've had economics training, as many of my students have, you've encountered the idea in another form, opportunity costs. Most of my students could write an essay describing and discussing that important economics concept. So why did they say that BATNA has been so important to them? I think because BATNA makes an important idea much more operational and accessible. The better my students understand their BATNA, the better they know when to walk away and how to approach the negotiation. And the better they know when they're weak and need to take action to build strength. In short, BATNA reveals leverage and perspective, and they don't really realize that they need to think about it in conflicts and negotiations until they learn that term. In fact, BATNA is so important that sometimes it can produce an agreement without a party even negotiating. If you've ever had a telephone company or a credit card company unilaterally offer you better terms and conditions than your existing contract offers, it's probably because they're facing increased competition. That is, they know you have more choice and can walk away. Your BATNA has improved without you even realizing it, and you got a better offer as a result. I've had this experience. A few years ago, I was sitting in my apartment when my landlord called and said, "I just wanted to let you know that I'll be raising your monthly rent when the lease ends from $1,000 to $1,100 a month." I thanked him for letting me know, and then went out and began looking for another apartment. A few weeks later, I found one I liked, $700 a month, right next door. Smaller, but perfectly adequate. So I called him back, and I told him, I just wanted to let you know that I'll be moving out at the end of the lease term. Now, this was in the middle of a recession, and to my amazement, I heard a New York City landlord speak words I never thought I would hear him say. "Would you consider staying if I canceled the rent increase?" I was stunned, but I said, "No, thanks anyway, I think I'll move." Then he said, "What if I lowered the rent?" Now I was completely flummoxed. I didn't know much about negotiating then, but fortunately I had the presence to say, "Well, how much did you have in mind?" And he said, "How about 900? Now what do I do? So I asked him if I could call him back, and he said yes. And so I thought about it, and I finally called him back. And I said, "Thank you for your offer, but I think I'm going to move anyway." So he said, "What if I lowered it to 800? Now what do I say? So again, I asked him if I could call him back, and he said, "Sure." So I went back and forth, and finally I called back, and I declined the offer, and I moved out. So several years later, I was beginning to teach negotiation. For the first time, I asked myself, was there ever a time in my life where having a strong BATNA made a difference for me? And finally, and suddenly, the little light bulb went on over my head, and I realized for the first time, oh my goodness, that time with a landlord, I was negotiating, and I didn't even realize it. Now, how can you get a New York City landlord to lower his rent 20% or more and not even realize that you're negotiating? Simple. I had a strong BATNA, and he didn't. If we didn't agree, I was set. I was moving to another apartment and hadn't even considered negotiating. But he was in trouble. He faced the prospect of an empty apartment for months in a recession, the cost of renovating an apartment, finding another tenant who might be less reliable, and then going through all the paperwork. His BATNA was weak. Unwittingly, I had been doing what skilled negotiators normally do as they gear up for an important negotiation. They develop their BATNA. Skilled negotiators do this intentionally with creativity and research. Often, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, your BATNA, is not the most obvious alternative to agreement that you have. For example, when you're faced with a conflict, it can seem like the best or only solution is litigation. But a skilled negotiator realizes that litigation is just one choice. It's just one possible alternative to agreement, and she would be very wise to explore other possibilities. In a dispute with a car manufacturer, for example, that might include seeking a government agency or some other champion who can fight for her, developing some self-help measures such as withholding car payments, seeking allies like other disgruntled car buyers, considering alternatives to litigation such as mediation or arbitration, and researching and brainstorming still more non-obvious choices. Earlier, we were talking about Martin Luther King and nonviolent action. One scholar has identified 198 different ways to practice nonviolence, and in a sense, it's a list of possible alternatives to agreement. Boycotting, sitting in, lobbying Congress, staging demonstrations, and building coalitions. Their value lies in giving activists more choices that can improve their leverage, and so improve the chances to eventually negotiate with powerful counterparts. Looking beyond the obvious to discover an effective BATNA is also crucial for entrepreneurs. Many students in my entrepreneurship classes first think that an entrepreneur is doing well if she quickly negotiates deals to raise lots of money from investors. But studies and experienced entrepreneurs emphasize that this may be the biggest mistake you can make as an entrepreneur. A much better bet may be to do something called bootstrapping, where the entrepreneur starts up inexpensively, experiments, makes mistakes at low cost, and shapes the venture until it's ready to put investment money to good use. In effect, bootstrapping is a very attractive BATNA for an entrepreneur in her early talks with early investors. Developing your BATNA can make a difference even at the highest levels of diplomacy. Indeed, we might argue that war itself often seems like a nation's BATNA. The Swiss military theorist Clausewitz famously said, "War is the continuation of politics by other methods, that is, an alternative to agreement." Currently, the world spends over $1 trillion, a twelfth of its gross national products, on militaries. In large measure, nations do this so that during a conflict, a leader can stand up and say, "While we hope we can resolve this matter peacefully, we reserve the right to use all possible alternatives." This is not to say that military force is the best alternative to agreement, just that nations often suggest that it is. It's not enough, though, for a nation's leader, an entrepreneur, or any negotiator to think about her BATNA. She also has to think about the other side's BATNA. Underestimating the other side's strength is a good way to be ruined at the bargaining table. In an early episode of the hit TV sitcom Seinfeld, Jerry and George get an offer from NBC to produce a pilot sitcom. NBC offers $13,000. Jerry is happy. George is unhappy. Very unhappy. He figures if a TV star like Ted Danson gets $800,000 for a sitcom episode, so should they. Everyone around him warns him that NBC hardly thinks of him as Ted Danson, and that NBC can choose from dozens of other writers' screenplays. George insists. Speaking for both of them, George tells NBC they are declining the offer because it is too low. NBC lets them go. Surprise! Now George is desperate. He crawls back to NBC, eventually begging them to agree to $8,000, which they reluctantly do. "I was under the impression," Jerry says, "that the point of negotiation is to get more, not less. You know, this is the way they negotiate in the bizarro world." George illustrates the danger of underestimating the other side's BATNA. But there's a converse problem. It's very easy to overestimate the other side's too. There's a famous counterculture cartoon called Bambi Meets Godzilla that opens with Bambi peacefully grazing to the sound of pastoral music when suddenly an enormous foot crashes down on him, leaving only the feet sticking out. Credits roll. Often, we feel like Bambi, and the other side seems ginormous and intimidating, a virtual Godzilla with overwhelming alternatives to agreement, who is therefore totally unwilling to negotiate. But do not fear. We'll actually devote a full session later to developing ways to negotiate when you feel you're negotiating with Godzilla. And here, too, we can begin to think about how to cope. Skilled negotiators strive to avoid being like George on the one hand and Bambi on the other. How? By carefully preparing. Not just by developing several alternatives, but also by learning as much as they can about the other sides, including their best and worst alternatives to agreement. Bambi was oblivious. George was winging it. But diplomats, sports agents, lawyers, and other skilled negotiators devote time to understanding the choices each side has. To capture that ability, I recommend that you intentionally list out at least 5 alternatives to agreement that you have, and separately, at least 5 that the other side might have. And do some research to better know which they're likely to rely on. For example, during a billing dispute with a big supplier, you might want to learn if it has a reputation for litigation, if it refers disputes to credit agencies, cuts off buyers, or tends to do something else. A sobering question, isn't it? And here's one more. What's the worst thing that could happen if you don't agree? That is, what is your worst alternative to a negotiated agreement, or WATNA? Just as a skilled negotiator thinks about the best choices she has, she also thinks about the worst. In part, this helps by sobering you. It's easy to overestimate your strength by thinking about this long list of alternatives to agreement, and it means that you're more powerful, you think, than you really are, because you usually can't use all those alternatives. Further, it's easy to overlook the fact that you may have worries of your own, especially if your BATNA doesn't work out. For example, if you're negotiating for a new job, your BATNA may seem like an exciting alternative job prospect elsewhere, but if it doesn't come through soon, your WATNA may be continued unemployment. But before you throw in the towel and get very discouraged, consider that the other side probably has a worrisome WATNA too. That's important in part because it's often the fear of what will happen if they don't reach a deal that may motivate them to reach a deal. As the saying goes, doubts drive deals. The Northern Ireland Peace Accord may have been achieved in large part because the parties and their constituents knew they didn't want to go back to the Troubles, that is, the violent warfare they'd faced for decades. Even seemingly overwhelming negotiation counterparts have worries too. You may be negotiating for a job with a company that has 600 other applicants, but once a company makes an offer, they often have their own worries. They may not want to restart the job search, bringing in more candidates, wasting more time filling the slot, getting another consensus among the decision makers. Understanding the specific situation you face isn't always easy, and it's easy to overplay or underplay one's hand. But keep in mind that we have a natural tendency to project our anxieties and think the other side is strong and that we're weak. So skilled negotiators strive to learn as much as they can and bring a measure of equanimity to the talks, a reasonable confidence grounded in understanding. They also realize that they must be ready to cope with threats and intimidation, attempts by the other side to exaggerate its own BATNA and thus its leverage. As we will see, one way to cope with that threat is to actually role play. During the Civil Rights era, nonviolent activists prepared marchers for intimidating tactics by role-playing with them so that they wouldn't be intimidated during the actual marches. Savvy work, to be sure. And while we're on the subject of savvy, let's here note a couple of easy mistakes to avoid when you're tempted to talk a lot about your BATNA. Imagine you're trying to sell your gas station to a corporate buyer, and you tell her, we have an offer for $175,000 from another buyer. What will the corporate buyer say? Okay, we can offer you $175,000 and 5 cents. Okay, she probably won't try to beat the other offer by a nickel, but you see the point. You've now invited her to offer you a barely better deal. For this reason, while it can be wise to allude to your BATNA, it's usually unwise to reveal it in detail. Better. Well, I do have another offer. I can't say how much, but I can say it's significantly better than you're offering. I'd love to work with you if I can. Can you do better? And this raises a larger point. While sharing information can be wise, sharing too much of the wrong kind can destroy your BATNA altogether. Shortly before the Civil War, a young geologist named Theodore Judah discovered the pass in the California Sierras that would finally allow industrialists to build a transcontinental railroad. He quickly headed for San Francisco and met there with a group of business leaders. At the meeting, he opened up his maps and showed them the exact spot where the pass was. Make me a partner, he said, and I'll help you build it. They did, and let him successfully lobby Congress for support, but to Judah's surprise, they soon treated him indifferently, kept him uninformed about their decisions, and effectively squeezed him out of the company with little to show for his efforts. The rest of the industrialists got rich. One of them was named Leland Stanford, the founder of Stanford University. I called Judah's mistake the Leland-Stanford problem. By giving away all the valuable information he had during the talks and retaining little reason to keep him on board, he essentially made the industrialist BATNA strong and his weak. If they broke up, they were set, and he had nothing unique to contribute anymore. Judah might have been wise to say, this will give you a rough idea of where the pass is, but I can't reveal the exact location or what the special geological problems are with it at this stage. I'm sure, though, we can work out a fair arrangement that serves us all well, and then work to make sure that the deal didn't leave him vulnerable to a squeeze-out. Similarly, some suggest that a whistleblower might be wise not to give all her information to the press and prosecutors immediately. As the accused start to fight back, they may try to fire or ruin the whistleblower, lying about what she shared so far and insisting that there's nothing to the allegations. They may win, unless she has an ace in the hole. more information she can share with the prosecutors later on that further proves her case or disproves their claims. But what if you do everything I'm suggesting and find you simply have a very weak or non-existent BATNA and little hope of developing one? We've all found ourselves in that situation sooner or later. So what can you do? In a nutshell, the best thing to do is to work harder on those parts of the negotiation that you can change. Drawing on our first sessions, that partly means thinking more deeply about the interests, doing more factual and financial research, developing more creative options, and spending more time on rapport building, each of which can be sources of hope and power. It also means using more fully the many other tools and ideas we'll explore in future sessions. As we'll see, there are lots of examples of people who first thought they had no hope, then used their negotiation skills and turned things around beautifully, even without much leverage. But now let me show you how spending time thinking about BATNA can help you transform negotiations, even with an intimidating counterpart. During the 1970s, the British government sought to negotiate with the governor of the small island nation of Malta for much lower rent for the Navy base they kept there. Malta relied heavily on British lease payments, but seemed like the proverbial Bambi to the British Godzilla. But then, the governor of Malta began talks with the Soviet Union about the possibility of keeping a Navy base there instead of Britain's. Now, the United States and the British government leaned heavily on the dismayed British diplomats, insisting that they re-sign the British lease at all costs. Instead of lowering the £7 million annual rent, the two sides eventually tripled it. By developing Malta's BATNA and Britain's WATNA, the governor of Malta got the best of the British negotiators. And this brings us full circle to the story of Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. In 1957, two years after the modern movement began, Congress passed an anemic Civil Rights Act that did little, if anything, to help African Americans. But by 1965, the U.S. Congress had passed sweeping legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that began a revolution in the legal status of African Americans. Rather than accept a trivial concession by a seemingly implacable counterpart, the U.S. government, King and his followers pressed the struggle, galvanizing the conscience of the nation with creative nonviolence and massive demonstrations that, as King said, helped them write the legislation in the streets. And this story illuminates an important final point. Negotiation and peace itself sometimes require the ability to fight. When we speak of BATNA, we are sometimes speaking of developing one's ability to fight. As King demonstrated, it is possible and indeed eminently wise to fight an implacable counterpart without bearing any animosity, to once again be hard on the problem, soft on the person, which means that even when we develop leverage, we want to use it in ways that permit us to show respect for the other side whenever possible, and allow them to change their approach without losing face. Or, as the authors of Getting the Yes put it, bring them to their senses, not their knees. Much of what we've explored in the course so far can help you do just that. Here then is a challenge, the Alternatives to Agreement challenge. The next time you face a difficult negotiation or conflict, see what happens if you step back, do some research, brainstorm, and intentionally develop 5 separate alternatives to agreement. Then identify a BATNA and a WATNA. If you like, see if you can also identify the other side's BATNA and WATNA in the same way. See what a difference your enriched understanding of the situation makes for your efforts. After several sessions, we've developed a set of ideas that will be valuable in any negotiation and that can help you be more creative, tactful, and effective in your talks with others. We said earlier that there are 2 basic kinds of negotiation, creative and competitive. And while we've hinted at the second kind, the time has come to explore it directly. We'll do that beginning in our next session.